I'm videotaping this for prosperity, and I put it up on the internet, YouTube, for everyone. If you go to LionelWolford.com and you look into Educator, you can find how to get to the videos. If you go to my YouTube site right up here, you can find it from my site's better. If you go to the church's site, they have a link that goes to my YouTube site or to some site, I think that Devin, my wife, set up for me that has the video link so that you can go see it if you want to. This class is the first class in this Modern Issues. And this is kind of an unusual class. If you look at the list that I gave you, and I always give you, see, what am I supposed to call this? I used to call it gouge, and I call it cheat sheets. My wife told me I'm not supposed to use this kind of term, so what is this? This is our notes, the class notes.
There you go.
Crib notes, class notes. But I always give you class notes so that you have a reminder of what the class is about, and also this gives the course outline, and then what we're going to talk about today. Now, if you look at the course outline, it has introduction, tools, approaching modern issues from a Christian perspective. And it has life issues, medical issues, health issues, abortion, euthanasia, stem cell research, marriage, adultery, sexual sin, private property, finances, capitalism, social welfare, taxes, gambling, government, military, etc., responsibility, Social Security. Each of these areas is a large grouping of similar subject matters. Science issues, a conclusion. And then studying modern history and literature. It's an optional course. I always leave a 13th in there in case we have an extra class, so I always have a 13th class prepared. But the point about these issues is you've probably been taught all your life that these are opinion issues. These are simply issues of opinion. Now, we are going to define subjects in this class that are very basic. And many of them you may not have heard, some of them you may have heard. But let me tell you right now that governing these issues, there are things that we can prove in truth about these issues. And I'm not talking about the, what was that thing, the Bible thing, what was it? The Truth Project. Remember the Truth Project?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I'm not against the Truth Project. I think it's a great idea. But the basic point of the Truth Project was we believe it because the Bible says it, right? If you go with that attitude to your secular neighbors, what will they tell you?
I don't believe the Bible.
Well, who believes the Bible? I mean, you say it's inspired, but, the Bhagavad Gita is inspired, right? And so is the Book of the Dead from the Egyptians, and so is the Quran, and so is this. So you have no basis for argument, because really, whether the Bible is inspired or not is an issue of opinion and faith. Well, we like to say faith, but what is it really? It's a question of opinion. Because one person's faith is another man's opinion. So how can you approach people with truth? And how can you know what is truth? Now, it is very popular in the 20th century, and we're in the 21st century today, but in the 20th century it was very popular, and still in the 21st century, to say that you can't know truth. I'm here to tell you that people have been lying to you, because I'm going to show you how to know truth. And I'm going to show you that in these issues that I've listed for you, that these issues literally are about 95% facts, maybe 5% of what we are going to define within the structure of our tools, and about 1% opinion. Does anybody know what we call it when we move into the realm of opinion on these ideas? Or thoughts? Well, we'll get there. But in any case, I want to lay a framework, because this is not a class about opinions. Now, there's nothing wrong with raising opinions. When I teach classes I don't like to say I teach Bible classes. I teach classes in Greek or Hebrew documents, ancient Hebrew, Greek and Hebrew documents. So when we study those classes, we try to stay away from opinion or theology or doctrine. We always talk about the language and the culture and the history, things that are facts that we can prove. We're going to approach these issues the same way. with facts of things that we can prove. Now, if you bring up an opinion, or if I bring up an opinion, we'll handle it the same way that we handle theological doctrinal issues. We'll point out the fact that, hey, that's an opinion. We'll try to find, we'll try to associate why that's an opinion, and then we move from there. Do you see? So there's nothing wrong with bringing up opinions or asking opinions or even, disagreement or talks. But what we always try to do is go back to the tools. Because if you have tools, if you have a set of tools that you can define what is truth, then what can you do? You can define truth, right? Now, I'll tell you this is another interesting thing. Every century, and we're going to see this because right now it's I'm giving a little overview, but every century except the 20th and 21st century, what do you think the major application of human intellect and ingenuity was toward? I wouldn't say religion.
Scientific research.
I wouldn't say science either. It was to determine truth. Remember the Greeks. What were the Greeks seeking? Truth. What's half the words that are spoken by Christ in the New Testament? Truth. Either aletheia or amen. Both those translated into Greek as truth. How about the empiricists? How about the non-empiricists of the medieval period, of what's considered the Dark Ages? What were they trying to seek? Truth. What were the philosophers of the Age of Reason trying to seek? Truth. What were the empiricists, the inventors of scientific thought, trying to find? Truth. Up until the 20th century, the assumption was that the reason for science, the reason for all these things was to determine truth. So how can we determine truth? Now, giving a little overview, let's get into more details about the specifics of history. But let's ask this question. Let's posit it this way, because this will be a little different than the way I've put it before. If everyone has been looking for truth since the beginning, the dawn of human civilization, do you think that someone might have determined some tools for figuring out what truth is? What do you think?
Yes, I hope so.
Well, you'd hope so, right? Have you heard of them?
Yes.
Okay, anybody want to venture one?
Scientific method.
Very good. This means that your schooling did not go to waste, you see? Scientific method. Scientific method. Okay. What can we use the scientific method to prove? Only repeatable. Okay, now how does that work? Okay, for those that aren't super familiar with scientific method can only be used for repeatable events because the posit of the scientific method is how does it work? How does the scientific method work, basically?
Theory.
You develop a theory, and then what do? You find a way to prove it, an experiment to prove it, right? So I develop a theory, so I have a theory. A theory like, for example, give me a theory. Give me a good theory that we can mess with.
The earth revolves around the sun.
Okay, the earth revolves around the sun. Earth
There you go.
around the sun. Okay, something like that. Oh, this one. The earth revolves around the sun. Okay? All right, so the earth revolves around the sun. That's a good one. So how can we prove that?
Observations.
We do scientific observations. Now, if the scientific observations turn out differently than we expected, what happened?
Change the observations.
Well, it means we're wrong, right? It means we're wrong.
Did not prove the theory.
It doesn't prove the theory. So then you have to go and develop another one. But the point is that it has to be repeatable. So unrepeatable events cannot be proven with the scientific method. It's impossible. So what can I not prove with the scientific method?
Things that can't be repeated.
So name me some unrepeatable events.
Big
Creation.
Creation, Big Bang, unless the creation happens over and over again, right? If the creation happens over and over again, or the Big Bang happens over and over again, now there's issues, we can talk about those, we'll get to those in another class. But, okay, if it's repeatable, I can prove it. But things that are singular, unique events, name me some other events. How about this class?
Resurrection.
What's that?
Resurrection, Jesus' resurrection.
The resurrection, because it's a unique event, right? Well, can you prove, is any event in history repeatable?
No.
Unlikely.
No! I mean, it's by the fact that we like to say, you know, history repeats itself. Does it really?
Generically.
You know, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. Can't repeat itself. So, what tool, this is the tool we use, and let me give you a little more history about this because,
Lionel?
yes,
Not to be ultra semantic.
go ahead.
Instead of theory, isn't the correct word hypothesis?
Yes.
Because there is a difference between the two.
It is true. You have a hypothesis, but it's very similar. Very similar, but yeah. You want to find a difference? I don't think I can.
Well, a theory does not necessarily have to have substantial facts. A theory is closer to an opinion, where a hypothesis, you have a set of predetermined things that you're going to prove or disprove.
I'll go for that. That sounds really good to me. And, you know, and that shows within the context of, you know, this is what this class is about. Because a lot of what we'll talk about, you'll see is definitions.
Semantics.
So, well, I don't like to use the word semantics because that is probably not a very safe word to get into. Because, you see, that assumes something else. What does semantics assume? The concept.
Understanding of the meaning of the word.
Well, words may have different meanings depending on who you are. And that's not true. Okay? Here is something that's very important. That in the concept of truth, that means that we have to be communicating on at least some level that we all understand. And if we need to, we'll bring out Merriam's dictionary, right? The point is that it does matter what words mean. And words have ultimate meanings. They're not, we can't just create or invent them. So,
They change.
well, words can change. Actually,
Are you gay?
the meanings may have a different substantial definition, but that, you know, through time. But yeah, now that becomes semantics. That's that concept. But in any case, the scientific method was invented by the Greeks at about 500. Let's see. Actually, the scientific method specifically was invented. Aristotle is probably the father of this. So about 300, 250 BC. Approximately. There are tags as early as about 500 BC, but scientific method really an Aristotelian concept. Now, what is the other way? Now, we said that we can't use a scientific method to prove non-repeatable events. Is there a method we can use to prove non-repeatable events?
Legal historical.
The legal historical method. Legal historical. This is also called the witness method. This is the method, and I always have to remind you, because I always teach this method because it's very critical. The legal historical method is the method we use to put people in jail and to death into prison. Because this is the method whereby you prove events that happen that are non-repeatable unique events. So every crime is a non-repeatable unique event, right? You can prove this class existed using legal historical method. How would you do that? How could you prove that this class existed in time? You could interview people that were witnesses, that were direct witnesses. You could interview, for example, Betty isn't here, so Butch tells Betty that he went to the class. She's a secondary witness if she writes something down, perhaps.
We have an historical document.
We have a historical document that's a record of this class.
We have the law.
We have a log and attendance sheets. So this is the way that you prove things in the legal historical method. It's very popular in the world today to say that this is not a very good method. Is it a good method?
Yeah.
You know it's a good method. It's the only way you can know history, right? I mean, if you don't have this method, what does that mean about history? It didn't happen. It doesn't exist. Now, you know, it's true, there are issues, you know. Are there issues with the scientific method?
Yeah.
So what do you do to fix those issues?
Refine your tools.
Well, you may refine your tools, but somebody else repeats the experiment, right? If it's a repeatable experiment, repeatable by others, then that, you know, in history, you keep doing it. I mean, for example, experiments you did in gravity when you were in junior high school or high school, right? Well, they've been doing those since Newton, right? So theory of gravity, hypothesis of gravity, if you like, you know, that's a pretty good one, right? We can measure it. Well, the legal historical is the same way, based on how good the witnesses are. And, you know, we've already stated that, you know, if we really wanted to, we could develop some pretty good witness stuff. You know, like, for example, meetings that you go to. Like, if you go to a board meeting, the church's meetings, what do we have? We have records that we keep. We may have video records. We have audio records. We have photographic records. All these records, you know, are the records we use in the legal historical method. These are the two methods for knowing truth in the what world? In the physical world. You can use these methods to know truth in the physical world. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Where does probability and statistics fall? What
Mm.
realm does that fall into?
We'll get there. We're going to move into that. So hold that idea. You're already bridging the gap in a beautiful way. Let's talk about this just a little bit. Okay, in history, what do we call the study of the world as it is? The study, what is the generic term for the study of the physical world? Oh man, you're beautiful. Physical is philosophy. Philosophia. Philosophia in Greek means literally the love of wisdom. But it specifically means in Greek, basically to seek, to know the love of knowledge of the world as it is. Now, what does that mean? Philosophia, let me draw you a chart about what the Greeks believed about the world. Because all of, you know, okay, why do we think that people are made of spirit, soul, and body? Because the Greeks did. Because the Hebrews didn't believe that at all. Why do we believe, why do we have the idea of philosophia? Why are half of our words from the Greek, or more?
Because
Because they're smart.
Smarter than we are.
You know, most of our ideas come from the Greeks, and most of the modern world's ideas come from the Greeks. The Greeks happened to invent, the legal historical method I should have mentioned was invented around 500 BC by Theodocles. Theodocles is the first writer who really used legal historical. We've talked about that in other classes. But we had, you know, the scientific method from Aristotle in about 250 BC. We have the legal historical method around 500 BC with Theodocles. Greeks. Now, philosophia. Why is this important? This is the way the Greeks viewed the world. This is, okay, pretend that this board is the plenum of the universe. This is everything that is, okay? Within that, the Greeks believed that the cosmos was the created universe. That's the creation. Created by whom? The Greeks had a real problem with that, but that's okay. But, you know, there is the cosmos, which is the created universe within the plenum of everything. Now, within the cosmos is the physical world. This is the world that we can know through the legal historical method and through the scientific method. Because when people talk about, you know how people talk all the time about, I'll believe it if it's empirical, right? What does empirical mean? It means legal historical and scientific method. Now the problem is, in the modern world, what have they lost? What have they missed? Legal historical method is very rarely taught in our colleges except to our lawyers in the modern world.
And the tax people.
And, well, maybe the tax people. But the problem is that if you don't have both, what have you missed? You've missed, this is empirical. Empirical means based in the physical world. So if you have both these, then you can prove empirical facts. But guess what? scientific method depends on legal historical method because every experiment is what? Unique, right? Every experiment is a unique experiment that is use the legal historical method to record that event. So, scientific method is actually dependent on the legal historical method. Do you see why the legal historical method was invented first? Very interesting, isn't it? So I can use a legal historical method and the scientific method to prove the reality of things, the truth of things in the physical world. But what's the problem with that? There's,
Interpretation of the data.
well, I wouldn't say that because facts are facts. Facts really are facts.
Well, but like in the scientific study, depending upon how you do, you're looking at a manipulation of the numbers, I can make a study break and say whatever I want to say.
Statisticians would disagree with you, and I do a lot of statistics for a flight test, and I would disagree with you too. The thing is that when you start talking about issues, when you begin to speak about issues where opinion matters, you have now moved into a different realm than we're even talking about. Now, I know that's hard to understand, but for example, in behavioral sciences or other sciences that are very dependent on, for example, opinions or statistical analysis of opinions or ideas, right? That's what you're basically getting into. See what I'm talking about? As opposed to if I drop a ball from a certain height every time and it hits the ground. So what she is getting to and alluding to is very important in this class. But it's a different issue altogether, and we're going to get there. We'll get there. We'll understand this because it's very important to understand this idea in difference. Because once we gather the idea of what can we prove in the physical world empirically, and what can we prove using other techniques and means, other singular techniques and means, we'll see what those are. Well, I give it to you. There are things that are outside the physical world that exist. Can you name me one? I can name you one right here. Emotions. Emotions do not exist in the, they're not physical things. Thoughts. What about thoughts? Are thoughts, can I prove a thought? I can write down a thought. But a thought itself is basically a amorphous thing that exists outside of the physical reality. Anytime we begin to talk about spiritual things, now spiritual things begin to become an issue simply of perhaps opinion, right? Interpretation, opinion, or ideas. But those are things that are outside of physical reality. The Greeks said that within the cosmos, the creation, but outside the physical world, there is an area that they called philosophia. Philosophia, meaning those things that men can know. I'll give you a beautiful example of things that men can know. Now, well, let me do this before that, because I want to give you a little bit of prop into this of how we got to where we think today. But in any case, this is philosophia. Things that people can know. So for example, can you know emotions? Yes, you can experience them, you can experience them in other people. But do you really know what that other person is emoting? Not really.
Not unless they tell you.
Well, yeah, and even then they may be lying, right? That's the hardest problem. That's Schopenhauer's question. Unless you tell, even when you tell me, I don't know if you're telling me the truth, right? I can never know the truth about an emotion or thought. But yet they're real, right? They're real. They have to exist. They have to exist.
They can affect you physically.
And they can't. Well, not only can they affect you physically, they can affect the entire world physically. Right? So the physical world is, this cracks me up. Those that are seeking only empirical thought are idiots. Because even saying empirical thought, you're already assuming what? Something that does not exist in physical reality, a thought. So, for example, what's the famous atheist guy? There's a couple of nutheads out there, real nutheads. You know, that say, the only thing that exists are those things that I can prove empirically. Well, they leave out the legal historical method in the first place, so they're really cut off, you know, most of what you can know. But on the other hand, they also say that only those things that are within the physical reality are empirical, that is scientific methods, what they mean, are those things which are real. But yet, would they ever negate the fact of anger? I mean, they may negate the fact of love, but of anger, of jealousy, of fear. I mean, you find fear in animals, right? So, we can never lose sight of the fact that it is, and I haven't even begun to prove anything to you, right? We have not begun to prove anything. But yet already, do you see how we have asserted by singular definition a truth?
Building a hypothesis here.
There are things outside of physical reality that we know exist. The Greeks asserted that within this area of knowledge, of things that you can know, are spiritual things. Now, let me go really quickly into Philosophia. Now, I happen to have, by luck and by God's grace, a PhD. Anybody know what a PhD?
Doctor of philosophy.
A doctor of philosophy.
Yeah.
Now, wait a second. I happen to have a degree in aerospace science, in aerospace engineering. So how could that be a doctor of philosophy?
Love of knowledge.
How could it be a doctor of philosophy? Because what do we think of when we think of philosophy?
Some spacey knowledge about how you should live.
Profound thought.
Yeah. What did somebody say? Or is that Butch? Yeah, you know, what we think of is we think of esoteric knowledge, or, you know, some kind of, you know, the Greek philosophers, right? Arguing about the meaning, semantics of words and the meaning of words, right? That's what we think of. But remember, the Greeks believed that philosophia was the study of what you can know. So therefore, a doctor of philosophy in aerospace engineering is a doctor that studies what?
What you know.
What you can know from engineering.
What you can know within aerospace engineering. And by the way, the only degree that you could, well, in the beginning, the only degree that you could ever get from a university until about the turn of the century. Anybody want to venture a guess?
Divinity.
A THD. What's a THD?
Doctor of theology.
Doctor of Theology. Now, what is important to note is the Greeks did not separate theology from philosophy. And neither did the early church. Who set up the first universities?
The church.
The church did. Well, the Greeks had lyceums. They had gymnasiums, lyceums, and schola, which are all different kind of entities. But they really never had a higher learning. The first people to set up higher learning was the church. Why? Why did the church set up places to learn more learning?
Because you can't know everything.
Why? Why was it so important to the church?
Spread the word.
Why?
Seeking truth.
Seeking truth. The church, remember, what is the origin of the Christian church? Christian church came out of the Greeks and the Hebrew thought. And as I've showed you in class after class, the New Testament is all written in Greek. The thinkers of the early church thought in terms of Greek. That's why we think the way we think. And so therefore, the very first universities gave degrees in theology. And then they broke it into pieces. And what were the two pieces they broke their training